Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am reviewing the Roderick Alleyn novel Dyed in the Wool by Ngaio Marsh, celebrating its 80th anniversary in 2025. This is a World War II set novel on New Zealand's South Island at the foothills of Mount Cook, or at the Cloud Piercer, as Marsh refers to it. This is a novel told in parts. It's a retrospective murder akin to Five Little Pigs. Similar but not exact structure. And as always, I will give a spoiler free summary up until the point of the murderer reveal, at which point I will warn you it's coming so you can back out if you need to. Spoilers will be fair game from that point forward. Before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. Dyed in the Wool begins with a very short prologue set 4 years before the main novel. It is 1939, and one Flossy Rubric and her husband Arthur are attending the sale of their wool at an auction. Flossie is this over the top personality who demands to be seen and demands having a prominent seat and turns the auction into this flashy, like, social event. It's not. She gets very excited when a Japanese man pays an exorbitant amount of money for the wool from Mount Moon. Mount Moon is the ranch where the Rubrics live. It is owned by Arthur, but you wouldn't really know that from Flossie's behavior. Flossie wants to meet with this Japanese man, Kurata Khan, but Arthur tries to stop her because Japan is not a friendly country, and she really shouldn't be like befriending this man because he could be an enemy. But Flossie is insistent, which leaves Arthur very angry with his wife's embarrassing behavior. We then jump 3 years to February 1942, where two wool merchants discover the dead body of Flossy Rubric in a wool clip. A wool clip is a wool bale. But actually, we get this really graphic description of what that is like, including the smell, because we're in New Zealand, so February is the summer and it's scorching hot. One of these workers mentions that Flossie had been missing for 3 weeks by the time they found her. We're now in the present, which is May 1943, 2 years before the novel was published. Roderick Alleyn is still doing intelligence work in New Zealand, coming off of his adventures in Color Scheme, which does get very lightly spoiled in this book, not to the point where the murderer is revealed or anything like that. But Alleyn has been asked to Mount Moon by Douglas Grace, who is Flossie's nephew. Technically, he was asked by Fabian Lose, who is Arthur's nephew. Douglas is convinced that because his Aunt Flossie was the local MP and she's very patriotic during the breakout of World War II, that a fifth columnist murdered her. Fabian does not buy that at all, but he did sort of lead Alleyn to believe he did to get Alleyn to come to visit. Because Alleyn has investigated fifth columnists in New Zealand in Color Scheme and also Money in the Morgue, that would be the novel Ngaio Marsh abandoned and completed very recently by Stella Duffy. Alleyn had actually met Flossie once before when he gave a presentation on spies, and Flossie was obsessed with Alleyn and she wanted to invite Alleyn to her house, but he did not accept that invitation. As Alleyn admires the magnificent landscape of New Zealand's South Island, this novel takes place in the vicinity of Mount Cook, or Aoraki, the center of South Island. Fabian Lose provides some of the details. We actually get like very nice descriptions of the island, as Ngaio Marsh is wont to do. She loves New Zealand and she does go overboard at times, but here she keeps it short and sweet, and it is for the better. Fabian tells Alleyn how Flossie disappeared. It was a hot January evening, and Flossie was preparing a speech she was going to give for rehabilitating soldiers from the war. And she was known to be a fantastic orator, but one that's just very over the top and dramatic. She was a perfectionist, and everyone basically had to serve her so it could all be perfect. And it was a hot day, and she insisted on dragging everyone outside to practice. But then Douglas noticed a diamond clip from Flossie's jacket was missing, so she demanded everyone look for it while she went down to the wool shed to test the acoustics for her speaking. Everyone looked for the diamond clip. That includes Fabian Lose, Douglas Grace, Terry Lynn, who was Flossie's secretary, and Ursula Harm, who was Flossie's ward. Arthur also got involved at times, and it was Arthur actually who found the diamond clip in a zinnia bush that had been searched many times before. Arthur Rubric, by the way, is also now dead from natural causes, and no one saw Flossie after she went down to the wool shed. The night she went missing, Ursula went up to Flossie's room to tell her they found the clip, but she found a note on the door saying "Do not disturb." It actually says "Do not knock. The only answer will be a snore." And this wasn't at all unusual. Flossie often went to bed early and didn't want to be disturbed because she would have to travel a long way the next day to get to Wellington, because she was supposed to travel to the Parliament. And so it wasn't unusual that no one saw her the next morning either. In fact, no one knew Flossie was missing for 5 days until an MP sent a telegram asking her why she never showed up. Turns out Tommy Johns, not the baseball player famous for his surgery, but this Tommy Johns is the manager of the sheep farm. He is an employee of technically Arthur, but in practice Flossie, and he was supposed to drive Flossie to the mail truck, and the mail truck would bring her all the way to Wellington. But she never showed up, and Tommy just assumed someone else drove her to the mail truck. The local police are just a complete loss, and it's been about 16 or so months since Flossie was murdered, and no one has any clue. So Alan was invited because Flossie's death may have something to do with espionage work, even if Fabian doesn't think so. But Fabian and Douglas have been working on a secretive war project, some kind of like magnetic fuse, so the possibility cannot be ruled out. Alan arrives at the sprawling Mount Moon and meets the others. Alan, in his intuitive self, describes these people beautifully internally. Really, Marsh is doing the description, but, I enjoyed her description of Fabian specifically, whom Alan says is so delicate it looks like he was drawn with a light pencil. Fabian suffers from PTSD because he was hit on the head at Dunkirk, and he describes himself as cracked. The word cracked is used a lot in this novel, and Douglas was also injured in the war. He was less severely injured because he was shot in the butt, which, as you can imagine, they make jokes about. But what strikes Alan the most about the house is that painting of Flossie displayed in Arthur's study, and the fact there's no pictures of Arthur in the study. But this painting is huge, and her eyes follow and stare you down. Alan asks if the painting is accurate to Flossie in real life, and Fabian and Terry say yes, but Ursula and Douglas say no. Ursula is very defensive of Flossie, whereas everyone else, sort of hated her. It's not fair to say they hated her. They do say they liked her, but, Flossie could be very domineering and unlikable. But Alan wants to hear everyone's perspective on Flossie. He's not interested in the events of the murder. He wants everyone's accounts on who Flossie is. Ursula goes first. And this is very, 5 little picks here, structure-wise, in this beginning section. Ursula was Flossie's ward, and she is fiercely defensive of her aunt. But she's not really her aunt. Flossie was her godmother, and Ursula's mother was best friends with her. And when her mother died, Flossie took Ursula in and basically spoiled her because Flossie didn't have any children of her own. And this happened in England. Flossie sort of goes back and forth between England and New Zealand, and she's only really permanently settled in New Zealand when the war broke out, which is something Ngaio Marsh did. And at that point, Flossie relocated with Ursula and Douglas and Fabian. And I'll get into this a bit in the criticism section, but I don't think the timeline as laid out by Ursula here actually makes sense. But to be honest, this could be intentional. This could be Ursula misremembering things. But she speaks overly glowingly about Flossie in a way the others don't seem to share. Terry is especially perturbed by this, and Ursula does appear to be blinded by Flossie's generosity toward her, so that she ignores her negative attributes. It gets brought up that she basically took over Arthur's life when she became an MP, and she dragged him all over the place and hosted parties, and Arthur couldn't handle it because he had a bad heart. Terry even says that Flossie's work killed Arthur because she would even intrude upon his private rooms at the house. But Ursula just scolds Terry for saying that. How dare she? Ursula also tells a story about how patriotic Flossie is and how great of a speaker she is, because on one occasion Flossie was giving a stump speech and she was heckled by this poor woman who said she couldn't afford eggs for her children, and Flossie is so rich and she doesn't understand what it's like to be poor, and oh boy, does this not ring true in 2025. But Flossie just scolds this woman, and Ursula is interpreting this as how great of a speaker Flossie is because she deals with hecklers and she was spectacular spectacular, and everybody laughed, and she just completely ignores the plight of this mother who can't afford eggs for her children, and which Douglas actually interrupts the story in here and says, reminds Ursula that woman still can't afford eggs, so that's where Ursula thinks. But Ursula resumes her story. The initial prime suspect appeared to be Cliff Johns. He is the teenage son of Tommy Johns, and Cliff is a very talented musician. Flossie paid for him to go to this expensive school, and then suddenly Flossie and Cliff got into a huge argument because Flossie basically planned Cliff's life out for him. She basically bought him. And Cliff was upset over being rejected for military service because he had bad eyes and basically became a communist. And he is from a community of sheep farmers, all of whom are communists. Flossie, of course, is vehemently anti-communist. Also, the butler Markins caught Cliff stealing whiskey from Arthur's cellar, which led to another fight with Flossie. However, Cliff actually has an alibi for when Flossie disappeared. He is the only person with a true alibi, it's stated. He was playing the piano at the local hall, and it could be heard as far away as the house. And because Ursula is the one telling this part of the story, she paints Cliff John as a scoundrel, a charlatan, for not being appreciative of Flossie, completely ignoring Flossie's own terrible behavior here. After Flossie's clip was found, Ursula wrote her aunt a note and stuck it under the door. Ursula then went to bed, but she couldn't sleep because she had this bad feeling and kept having nightmares, and she swears someone was walking around the hallway at 3 a.m. The next morning, Ursula cleaned up Flossie's room, and Terry found a piece of raw, greasy wool on the floor. She didn't tell anyone about this, but she did tell the police, and the police don't think that's important at all. And that's the end of Ursula's tale, and we move on to Douglas's story. Douglas is one of those ne'er-do-well scoundrels who isn't really a bad guy, but can be a jerk. This archetype is very common in Christie novels. I think the one who's the most apt comparison to Douglas is George Crossfield from After the Funeral. But anyway, Douglas likes to stir up trouble, and he casually mentions Terry and Arthur crossing paths while searching for the diamond clip, but Terry denies this, and Ursula backs up Douglas. During the search, Douglas left his assigned area of the garden to go inside the house and fetch some flashlights, or torches, as they are called in the novel. It was getting dark, so this was necessary, and he also had to take a phone call because Markins was not in the house when he should have been, which leads Douglas to bring up his suspicions of Markins, who is still employed at Mount Moon. Douglas suspects that Markins might be leaking information about his and Fabian's secret project. Douglas found Markins snooping around outside the room where they work, and also suspect Markins tried to steal the keys to the room. Markins also had photography equipment in his quarters, and photography equipment very expensive for a servant to afford at this time. Flossie hired Markins on the recommendation of Kurata Khan, that Japanese man who bought her wool in the prologue, which makes Douglas even more suspicious Markins is a spy. But Allen says Markins' references checked out. Fabian does not believe Markins is a spy, nor does he really think any fifth column stuff is going on. But anyway, almost everyone in the vicinity knew there was a secret project going on in Mount Moon, because Flossie had a very big mouth and told everyone. Flossie didn't actually know what the project was, but she did know vaguely what it was about. So the point is, anyone and everyone knew some kind of top secret project was happening at Mount Moon. But Douglas was convinced Markins is a spy, so he confronted Flossie about it, and she basically refused to consider the possibility. This led to a big argument between Flossie and Douglas that ended with Flossie saying Douglas was right, and she would confront Markins, though no one knows if she actually did. Flossie was too concerned about losing a good servant, since servants are hard to find. But Douglas pointed out that she's an MP, and it would be very embarrassing if she had a spy in her own house, but this fight, according to Fabian, caused Douglas to fall out of favor with Flossie, and that ends Douglas's tale. We then move on to Fabian's tale, and Fabian is wrestling with the possibility that he murdered Flossie, because while he was searching for the diamond clip, he blacked out, as he did on occasion because of that crack on his head, as he calls it. But he only blacked out for about 10 minutes, which isn't even remotely close to the amount of time needed to murder Flossie. But Fabian does have a motive. Shortly before she was murdered, Flossie and Fabian got into a fight because Fabian wanted to marry Ursula. He fell in love with Ursula because she took care of him when he would take a turn or have like a PTSD episode, but Flossie was not having any of that because Fabian wasn't good enough for Ursula because of his head injury. In retrospect, I wish I covered this novel back to back with The Murderer is a Fox because there's just so much connective tissue between the two. I covered that Ellery Queen novel earlier this year if you're interested. But here, Ngaio Marsh is also being critical of the lack of response to PTSD and soldiers injured during the war. And to be fair, it does seem like Fabian is at least seeing a doctor, unlike Davy. But the point is also made about the inadequate treatment for the condition. But Flossie's disapproval of Fabian and Ursula goes even beyond that. She wants her favorite nephew, Douglas, to marry Ursula, even to the point where she actually forbade Ursula from marrying Fabian for the rest of her life. Flossie did eventually knock that down to just 2 years because she got mad at Douglas over the Markins thing. Fabian also claimed Arthur got involved in this, but doesn't explain further. And even though Flossie is dead, Ursula is still sticking to this 2 year promise, and it hasn't quite been 2 years yet. But then we move on to Terry's account. And up until this point, Terry had been rather quiet. She hasn't been silent, but quiet. And when she does speak, she usually offers a sarcastic remark or a contradictory point. She's very cold and calculating. And she's not actually all that thrilled with opening up about her true feelings. And we learn pretty quickly this is because she hated Flossie. She thought Flossie was stupid. And this stands in stark contrast to the testimony of the other three. Ursula had glowing opinions of Flossie. Douglas admired her. Fabian didn't like her, but saw her as a shrewd woman. But Terry calls her stupid, and even accused her of plagiarizing her speeches from speeches she heard on the radio, and that she was pretty dumb in planning things. For instance, she had no funding for her rehabilitation effort, and she didn't even seem to recognize that she would need a plan. She just wanted to do, but she had no plan. So Arthur had to get involved and had to fix everything, and Terry is constantly going on about how much Arthur suffered because of Flossie, and Arthur had to do that, and Arthur did that, and how Flossie basically killed Arthur, and this is all leading up to a pretty big reveal that Terry fell in love with Arthur, and the feeling was reciprocated. And the next obvious question is, did Flossie know about this? And Terry said she did. Flossie had walked into the room when Terry had her hand intimately placed on Arthur's shoulder. Flossie never said anything, but her demeanor changed, and she tried to limit Terry's time with Arthur, and Flossie even began flirting with Arthur for the first time since their courtship days. And that concludes those 4 accounts. Alan got exactly what he wanted. He wasn't interested in the facts of the case. He already knew those. But he wanted to know about what people thought of Flossie. And he received 4 totally different personas, and he's about to receive more. But first, Alan retreats to bed to review the facts once more. He is actually staying in Flossie's room, and he notices the dark green carpet and how obvious a piece of wool would have looked against it, yet Ursula apparently hadn't seen it. And the murderer had to have gone back to Flossie's room during the night because her suitcase was hidden, and Ursula said she heard someone lurking around. Marsh gets a little bit technical here. It's not too bad, but she does explain, the circumstances of Flossie's murder, which up until this point had been notably absent. Flossie was hit on the head with a branding iron, but what really killed her was the wool. She suffocated to death in the wool. She was likely knocked unconscious, but this presents a bit of a problem, as this murder would have had to taken a long time to pull off because of the way she was found. The wool press, which is the device used to pack the wool into the bales, was already full for the night. So the murderer had to knock Flossie out, then unpack the wool, throw Flossie's body into the wool press, then pack the wool tightly so no one would notice the next day when the wool press was turned on. And we know the killer likely wore a pair of overalls belonging to Tommy John's to complete this task, but this would have taken a long time, so it's probably likely the murderer had to make a return trip. It's unclear and unknown, but Alan is left with the impression, but he's not totally sure, but he suspects one of the members of the search party is guilty. That would be the 4 living ones plus Arthur, but he doesn't see how it could have happened. He doesn't suspect any of the farm workers, but Fabian tells him they hated Flossie as well and would mock her behind her back. Fabian himself is a little bit of a communist. I say a little bit because he sort of believes in the idea of communism, but he's certainly not practicing it. Alan goes to bed and he hears someone skulking about, and it's Markins, the butler. Alan knows Markins is in fact a spy, but he's a spy for the Allies. He's in the special branch, and he was initially keeping tabs on Karada Khan, the Japanese man who bought the wool in the prologue, but Markins was then asked to go to Mount Moon because of that invention of Fabian's. And Markins knows for a fact information about that invention has been leaked, and he doesn't know who did it. But interestingly, it hadn't been leaked through Japanese channels, but through German channels. Probably from some Portuguese man who everyone but Terry and Arthur met at a racetrack. But then Markins drops a pretty big bombshell here that he wonders if the leaker wasn't Flossie herself. Flossie was constantly in the workroom when she shouldn't have been, and before she was murdered, she said she was going to bring up the idea of a spy in the Parliament, but she never did. To Markins, it was coming across as a little bit of the lady doth protest too much, which oddly does not get quoted despite being from Hamlet. Marsh never misses an opportunity to quote Shakespeare. She even quotes Hamlet multiple times in this book, but not that quote. We also learned later on that Flossie's patriotism is to the extreme, that it's really more jingoism than patriotism, and that she isn't even opposed to Nazi ideology. She's actually very sympathetic to Nazi causes like putting quote unquote undesirables in concentration camps and forcibly promoting traditional values. She only opposes Nazis because she's British and New Zealander, and Nazis are German. I mean, to her, it's like a sports team, a rival sports team. Markins also wonders about Douglas because before the war broke out, Douglas studied engineering in Heidelberg, Germany, and he too has Nazi sympathies. The following day, Alan meets some of the workers on the farm, and I can breeze through this section a bit. Basically, there were some odd things about the wool shed the morning after Flossie disappeared, but nothing too major. Some of the lower workers were scolded for not sweeping up properly the day before and for not replacing the candles in the lanterns, but they all said they had done that. And some of the hooks to raise the wool bundles were missing, the floor was greasy, and the graded wool was all mixed up in the bins, and no one admitted to doing any of these things. Alan meets Cliff Johns, who provides yet another interpretation of Flossie. Cliff Johns initially had a good relationship with Flossie, but they soured after a while. He liked that someone noticed his talents and was willing to help foster them. His parents were iffy, and they didn't like Cliff getting ideas above his station, but they also recognized their son had talent, and they wanted him to be more than a sheep farmer. But Flossie gradually became more and more possessive of Cliff, not allowing him any free will, while also constantly reminding him he was a member of the working class and not a wealthy person like she was. In Cliff's mind, Flossie essentially bought him because she didn't have children of her own, and she blamed Arthur for that. There was a time when Flossie went back to England for a bit, and she was not happy with Cliff when she returned. Cliff had tried to join the military, but he failed the physical, and Flossie was just absolutely thrilled about that, despite her being so patriotic. This was because she already had plans for Cliff, and this is when it all went to hell. They argued. Cliff became a communist. Flossie accused him of stealing the whiskey, but Cliff does have an alibi, and he was playing the piano at the annex, and everyone heard it the whole evening. He was even seen by Mrs. Duck, the cook, but Alan is interested in how old the piano is and why the radio program magazine from the week Flossie disappeared is missing. Alan speaks with Albie Black, who is another of the sheep shearers. He's a drunk, but he's not the worker who constantly throws up all over the place. That's Jack Merriweather. But Albie Black admits to something that Alan has long suspected. Cliff Johns did not steal the whiskey. Albie Black pinched the whiskey, and Cliff was merely returning it when he was caught. Cliff kept Albie's secret because he was loyal to his fellow sheep workers, and also because he had to deal with Albie. Albie actually saw Cliff Johns snooping around the wool shed at the time Flossie must have been murdered. This seems odd because Cliff should have been playing the piano. Later that night, Alan has an idea that he needs to pull up the planks of the wool shed from underneath of which is 30 years of sheep droppings, which thankfully we get spared from that description. We surely would have gotten otherwise. Ngaio Marsh is never one to shy away from awful, gross descriptions of things. Alan wants to search around and look for something, but he has a phone call to make and other things to do. He's also lost his cigarette case that his wife gave him, so he was going to go back to the annex to look for it. But his phone call went through at that moment, so Fabian went instead, and Fabian put on Alan's coat, so you absolutely know what's definitely coming here. Fabian gets attacked by an unknown assailant. He's hit over the head with a branding iron. Alan finds him and sends Markins to get Tommy and Cliff Johns. Fabian is still alive and he's fine, but he's unconscious and starts having hallucinations in his sleep. It's the PTSD. And Alan has some trouble calming him down until help arrives. And Fabian actually winds up punching Alan at one point, and he climbs up the wool shed banisters, I'm sorry. And this is where I end the spoiler-free section, so back out now if you don't want to be spoiled. You have been warned. Alan returns to the house to interview everyone for alibis, and I have to be honest, I think this is easily the weakest section of the novel. Nothing really happens here. Terry gets angry when Alan wants to read Arthur's diary, Douglas is a bit overeager to help, and Ursula is just a complete mess over Fabian, but no one has an alibi. Alan turns to Cliff Johns and tells him he knows Cliff was not playing the piano the night Flossie was murdered. What Cliff did was put on the radio, which was playing boxed Art of the Fugue, before running off the wool shed. This is why he threw away the program from that week and why Alan kept asking about the piano. The piano in the annex is not in good shape, so it couldn't have played the music so sweetly as it was described. Cliff felt remorse over the whiskey and the way he treated Flossie, so when saw Flossie going to the wool shed, he visited to apologize. However, when he arrived, he found Flossie's dead body. He initially ran for help, but then a bunch of the farm workers were approaching, and he suddenly panicked, so he kept quiet. And then he kept wondering for weeks what happened to the body, because Flossie's body never turned up. And Alan tells everyone he's going to his room, but in reality, he is staking out the wool shed with Markins as they read Arthur's diary. Arthur was aware that Flossie knew about him and Terry, and he didn't regret it at all. Although he did wish he wasn't hurting Flossie. He even noted how ironic it was to write about his affair in the very diary his wife gave him. But Alan is waiting for someone to show up in the wool shed, and that person falls right into Alan's trap. And that person is Douglas Grace, and he is arrested. Well, sort of. Now, my edition of this book doesn't have this issue, but I actually understand some editions of this book eliminate the epilogue where Alan explains everything. I also understand that some of the digital editions actually put like a recommended books page after Douglas is arrested, but before the epilogue, which makes it look like there is no epilogue. I don't understand how a publisher could be so careless as to do this, but, whatever. The epilogue is in the form of a letter Alan writes to Inspector Fox. Alan did spend some time thinking about his old friend Fox. It's easy to miss, but Alan has actually not seen Fox or Agatha Troy in about 3 years, since he's spent the entire war in New Zealand. But as Alan explains, the traitor had to be coming from inside the house. And since it was copied blueprints that were traded, it had to be either Douglas or Fabian who gave them away. And while it is possible someone broke in, the most logical deduction should be that it was someone actively working on the project, and since Fabian was later attacked, it could only leave Douglas. And Flossie began suspecting something was up with her nephew. Alan speculates that it was because Douglas was so forcefully pushing Markins as a spy that Flossie began to suspect Douglas. He was too forceful and practically begged her to get rid of Markins, whom Flossie believed to be completely innocent. And what really put Alan onto Douglas's trail was the diamond clip Flossie lost. It was Douglas who handled the coat it was on, and it was Douglas who pointed out it was missing. He stole the clip, knowing Flossie would make everyone look for it while she practiced her speech. During the search, he went in the house, presumably to look for a torch, but in reality, he was able to run down to the wool shed, murder Flossie, and then return to the house and put the sign on her bedroom door. He then rejoined the search. Because everyone else was distracted, no one noticed how long Douglas was really gone. He then planted the clip in a zinnia patch where Arthur easily found it in a place Arthur had already looked. That was a huge clue because the clip was so obvious it was either missed intentionally or planted later on once the deed was complete. And all of this tied into the character of Flossy Rubric. Everyone had different thoughts about her, but they had one thing in common. Douglas, Fabian, Ursula, Terry, Markins, Cliff Johns, they all said the same thing, that Flossie was shrewd, tenacious, and aware. She always acted with intention, and she was stubborn. And the key to solving her murder lied within her personality. Flossie was so adamant that Ursula married Douglas, and then all of a sudden changed her mind one day and said she could marry Fabian in 2 years. Flossie, who kept her eyes on Douglas, Flossie, and her defense of Markins. I didn't mention it earlier, but in Arthur's diary, he writes that Flossie actually told him who she suspected of being the spy, although he did not write the name down. But after Flossie's death, Arthur became something of a recluse and only allowed Terry and Markins into the room. He left Mount Moon to Fabian, which again would indicate none of those people were the spy. Flossie, who was going to look into the matter when she traveled to Wellington. And this is why Douglas killed her, because she was onto him, and she was just about to meet with intelligence officials who may have been able to trace the leaks back to him. We don't actually see this happen in the text, but as Alan writes, Douglas will not be brought up on charges because he's dead. And not only is he dead, he blew himself up in the wool shed. He tried to bring Alan down with him, but Alan got away. And there's also this whole thing about Douglas trying to get like a candle stub back after all this time. I'm going to talk more about that in the criticism section because that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But the novel ends with Alan writing another letter, this one to Troy. He writes he suspects the war is ending soon and that he hopes to be able to return home. He also bashes the painting of Flossie and says Troy would be horrified by it. At one point, it was suggested by, I think, Douglas that Agatha Troy should have painted the painting instead of whoever did. He also writes and that he wishes he didn't pass up that invitation Flossie extended to him before she died because he would have loved to get to know her when she was alive, with the implication that this all could have been avoided had Alan gone the first time Flossie invited him, and she would have passed her suspicions on Douglas onto him. Let's get into praise. I love this novel. I think the entire story is fantastic. I think it's entertaining. I love the way Marsh is able to merge the traditional whodunit with a more like thrillery sort of spy stuff here. This is not a thriller or a spy novel, but the themes are there. I often find mystery authors, including Marsh and other novels, struggle with this. It often feels like two plots sort of thrown into one, but here it is very smooth. Probably because she resists the temptation to go full out with the spy stuff. It does feel a very domestic murder. I think the cluing in this novel is excellent. Douglas being the one to point out the clip is missing and then planting it where it would be easily found is great. I love the way Marsh is able to use the character of Flossy Rubric into her plot, and Flossie's behavior being another pretty major clue. Douglas leaving the search to go into the house, another clue. Marcia lays the clues in so casually and so brilliantly you don't even realize they are clues. You should if you watched my video on how to solve a mystery novel, but I still think these are so easily missed despite how many times they are repeated. I think the characters here are spectacular. I think Flossie is probably March's greatest victim, one of the best victims from the golden age of detective fiction. There are so many layers to her, and they are all plot relevant and key to solving her murder. I also think Fabian, Ursula, Terry are all spectacular characters. Douglas is pretty good. Cliff Johns is pretty good. Arthur is fine for what we saw. I do feel like I wanted to see a little bit more of Arthur, but I liked what we got. I think we have beautiful descriptions in this novel. The way Marsh describes the painting of Flossie and how she dominated the room was excellent, and how that painting took over everything and pushed Arthur out of his own space. And the descriptions of the New Zealand landscape are great. You know, she describes Fabian as drawn with a faint pencil. She has great descriptions for everyone else. I appreciated her depictions of the working class sheep farmers who I felt were very true to life. I have to be honest, I don't know much about sheep farms. Everything I know about the wool industry comes from this novel, but I felt I was able to easily understand how a wool press works and how a sheep farm operates without getting like bogged down in the details. There's a lot of continuity with color scheme without really spoiling that book. Even though we don't have the other recurring characters, we do have Alan reminiscing about Troy and Fox, so their presence is still felt, especially their absence. Their absence is felt in a way that feels very intentional. I also appreciate that this novel doesn't get repetitive, despite having 6 major accounts plus a few minor ones. new details and new layers are always revealed so it doesn't become stale. I also enjoy some of the smaller details that don't really matter, but they add a little something special. This book has a lot of those small, intricate details, like the wool press operator who throws up whenever he thinks about it, and how he would have quit if Arthur didn't replace the press, and the sound of Cliff's piano wafting through the hills because it's New Zealand and the hills have that effect. There's a lot of very small details that bring a delight and a realism to this story. And as for criticism, I almost didn't want to cover this novel because I know every time I read this novel, I discover more things to criticize about it. My opinion does not go down. I would not lower this on the ranking, but I do find more things about it that don't quite work. And that was again the case on this reread. And to be fair, when I make these review videos, I am reading much closer than I normally would. I deliberately pull out the strings to make sure everything's working okay. I think the biggest issue for Dyed in the Wool is the structure. And it's not that the structure is bad, but it feels like the second part of the novel is a little bit of a different story than the first half. The second half of the novel is largely extraneous from a plot perspective. Everything you need to know to solve this mystery, you know by the time Markins finishes his perspective on Flossie. All the clues are in those first 5 perspectives. And it's not that the second half, which consists of Alan mostly on the farm, and Alan's speaking to the farm workers, isn't good or interesting or delightful, because it is. It's just not necessary. There isn't a lot of new information there to help you. I feel if you cut out the large part of that novel and just skipped ahead to when Fabian is attacked, I think the book works just as well as what we have. I wish Marsh had spread out those first 5 perspectives throughout the novel to make the book more balanced. She front loads them so we get the accounts from Ursula, Douglas, Fabian, Terry, and Markins in quick succession, and then we eventually get to the one from Cliff much later on, which, to be fair, is also helpful, but we sort of get scattered mini accounts from other people. It's not that it doesn't work, but it doesn't work optimally. It's not the best way of doing this. I also think there are some factual errors. Again, I'm willing to give Marsh the benefit of the doubt about the dates in Ursula's account, which appear to be wrong, but I think one can explain that away sufficiently as just Ursula is wrong what she's saying. There are times when when Marsh writes Fabian owned Mount Moon when it was still Arthur who owned it. It seems like she forgot about Arthur at times, to be honest. I think what she meant is that Fabian is the one running the farm because Arthur was too sick, but that's not what's stated. And Alan makes a comment several times that Terry found the wool wisp on the floor when she said she found it in the vacuum cleaner. These are minor for sure. They don't come close to outweighing the positives at all. But there are moments when I think Marsh isn't playing fair. For instance, we're not told until after the fact that the information that was passed on were physical copies of magnetic fuse diagram, which meant it only could have been passed on by someone with the access to the diagram. So it could only have been Douglas or Fabian. We weren't told that. We were only told information passed. I think there are moments that are a little contrived. Cliff's alibi of the piano and then him hiding the program felt contrived. It's certainly possible for sure, but it felt like the sort of thing that was a little over planned and unnatural. I think the farm workers not finding Flossie's body in the wool press is a bit of luck, especially considering that wool press isn't actually that big. I only just watched the adaptation for the first time, and I always believed the wool clips and the wool press were much larger than they really were, at least as what's depicted in the adaptation. So that did make it harder for me to believe that they didn't find Flossie's body. I wish we were privy to the scene where Douglas blows himself up in the wool shed. I understand why Marsh doesn't show this because the British public is on edge about bombs during the war, but I think it would have been a dramatic scene. I find much of the ending sequence when Fabian gets attacked just to not be that interesting. I never understood this bit about the candle. I don't know why Alan thinks he could find a burnt out candle stub underneath 16 months of sheep crap, or why it's so important to begin with. In fact, that's another error. Alan believes Douglas's fingerprints will be on the candle because he needed to go back to the wool shed in the middle of the night to bury Flossie in the wool. But that also means Douglas left Flossie alive for some reason. Like, again, very odd there. And he dropped the candle below the floorboards because someone was coming. But then the next day, we're actually told that someone let the candles burn out in the lantern still. So they wouldn't be a dropped candle. I also think there are small moments, nothing major, when the plot gets a little hard to follow if you're not familiar with some of the terms. This book does not get technical, nor does it assume the reader understands the wool industry, but there are a couple of minor moments to me that aren't entirely clear. You do need to kind of read it again. These negatives, however, do not overcome the positives. Dyed in the Wool is, to me, not a top tier Allen novel. I would say it's like in that second tier of novels that are really good. They're great, but they have some issues. But those issues are easy to get past because the novel is so strong to begin with. Again, I don't think this is a novel that's flaws overwhelm it, despite the fact that it does have those flaws. Let's talk about some characters, starting with Roderick Alleyn, our protagonist. And you might have noticed here that I do not have an image of Patrick Malahide, but George Baker. And yes, this is Inspector Allen. This is not Inspector Wexford. George Baker was the third actor to portray Allen on the screen. He played Allen in all four episodes of the 1977 series Ngaio Marsh Theater, one of which was Dyed in the Wool. And I liked Allen here. I did think it was a bit subdued, but the effects of the war and the war work are taking an exhausting toll on him. Also, the separation from his wife, Agatha Troy, and friends, mostly Inspector Fox, are also a factor here. He never mentions Nigel in this novel, actually. And I thought this was a great depiction of Allen in that Marsh lets the story take center stage and not the character. This is a good depiction of Allen, but not one great for like Allen character moments. It again, in that regard, is very Poirot and Five Little Pigs, where in that novel Christie uses Poirot to advance the story. It's not a standout novel for Poirot. Just like in this novel, it's not a standout for like Allen character moments, but Allen is there to gently move the plot along, and I think Marsh uses him very effectively here. And we have our murderer, Douglas Grace, who I had in my top 10 Marsh killers list at number 6. And I do think maybe now he's closer to like number 9 or 10. It's not that I didn't find him a good character, I think he is. But I noticed this time around that I don't think he stands out as much compared to the other characters in the novel. I think Fabian and Terry and Ursula and even Cliff Johns are more memorable, more interesting characters. But I still find Douglas is a very strong entry into the killer list, but there are just times he felt a little generic, a little safe. I was particularly bothered by a comment Markins made about how Douglas has Nazi sympathies, which is something we were told but not really shown. I would have liked to have seen Douglas like espouse like a view or two or make a comment leaning in that direction as a little bit of a hint. We don't really get that, but still, I thought his comments about his aunt were very revealing, and his insistence on Markins being a spy being the exact wrong person to accuse. I thought it was delightful and how he overplayed his hand a bit by insisting there was a spy. We're told it's Fabian who brought in Allen, but basically only because Douglas insisted. And if you read between the lines, Douglas never really thought Fabian would do that. It was a lot of, the lady doth protest too much, very much his aunt. And he was a bit of a comic relief at points, with him getting like shot in the butt, which is played for laughs and meant to point a finger at him. His injury is considered less serious by a lot than Fabian's, making Fabian the more sympathetic of the two. And him being a spy for the Germans is interesting. It comes across a lot more opportunistic than traitorous. I didn't get the sense that Douglas wanted the Germans to win. I think he was just out for money and notoriety, and that fits his character very well. And then we have our victim, Flossy Rubric, who I think might just be the best victim in an Allen novel. There is some other competition, but Flossie is a fantastic character, truly remarkable in the way Marsh depicts her, like Amyas and Caroline Crail from Five Little Pigs. Again, another Five Little Pigs comparison. Flossie is dead from the start of the novel, ignoring the prologue, and everything we learn about her is masterly crafted from the stories of other people. We have 6 major accounts of who Flossie is, plus a bunch of smaller ones, and they all tell different stories but have the same through line. Flossie was a woman who knew what she wanted, and nothing would stop her, even if she didn't know how to get that. And I see Flossy Rubric in the politicians of today who are constantly ignoring the needs of their constituents to make a big splash. I find politicians today are on TV way too often. And I actually think, Flossie is before her time. I can only speak for the US where I live, but this country is full of politicians who want attention and they want that sound bite and they don't want to do anything. And that is Flossie. Her putting down that woman with the eggs and her being more concerned about the way her speech sounds as opposed to the content of it is so modern coded. The latter of which, leads to her downfall. Her obsession with how she sounds isolates her from the group and allows Douglas to kill her. And her demand for perfection plays right into his plans. It is her downfall. And it's not canon in the novel, but in the adaptation, we actually see Douglas, as an unknown murderer, kill Flossie. He hits her over the head. And before he does so, she begs for her life. She cowers quite pathetically for her life, which stands in stark contrast to the persona she puts out. But I would argue is probably her true self. I mean, she is extremely selfish. She tries to take over everyone's life, like Ursula, like Arthur, like Cliff Johns. She's not interested in Arthur until another woman wants him. She has no ideology. She definitely has Nazi sympathies, as I stated earlier, and she only wants to defeat the Nazis because they're on the other side. They're on different teams. What the Nazis are doing is totally irrelevant. She doesn't care. And her helping the rehabilitating soldiers, she's not interested in rehabilitating soldiers. She's doing it because she knows that'll bring her attention. And it's sort of the thing a patriotic person would do that. But she doesn't actually have any interest in doing that, as evidenced by the fact that she has no idea how to do it. She has no plans on how to do it. She just wants to do it because she knows she should. She doesn't really care. And I think that's so telling of Flossie, especially as a politician of, I would argue, 2025. Now, I guess, historically, we look back at politicians in the 1945 era as sort of they're, altruistic and they're doing all these great things. They probably weren't. But still, that's it definitely in stark contrast to how I think we look at politicians of that day today. Moving on to regular characters, we have Fabian Los, the man drawn with a faint pencil, delicate yet striking. And I thought he had many layers to him. We have the delicate layer, the PTSD affected soldier who is struggling to move on and struggling to get the girl and Ursula, the man who keeps apologizing to Alan for no reason. But we also have the Fabian who does stand up for himself and fighting back against Flossie and Douglas, the man who invented a magnetic fuse, the man who runs Mount Moon and makes a lot of money off of the labor of farmers despite being a communist. He's probably the one who gives one of the more unbiased opinions of Flossie by stating all the things he didn't like about her, but recognizing her strengths. He recognizes the possibility of him being a murderer, as unlikely an option as that may be. He is someone very self-aware of what he doesn't know, yet blind to the things right in front of him. Ursula Harm was a bit of an over-the-top character, but in a very realistic and restrained way. She's not ridiculous. Completely blinded by Flossie's generosity, she cannot utter a bad word against her. This is so extreme it clouds her view of other people. She cannot fathom Cliff Johns as a good person because of Flossie's kindness toward him, despite that kindness coming with immense cruelty. And she thinks that, the mother who can't feed her starving children is the villain because she had the audacity to speak up. And whenever someone even mildly says something negative about Flossie, Ursula's just there to scold them. And she may be an adult, but she has that mind frame of a spoiled child. She has never worked for anything, and she still remains loyal to Flossie's wishes, even though Flossie is long dead. She loves Fabian, but, she would have married Douglas, let's be honest, if Flossie told her to. She has no mind of her own, and Marsh so expertly crafts her as this, infantile personality, yet one still easily a viable murder suspect. There's never a point where the reader is thinking, oh, it can't be Ursula based on her personality and character. Terry Lynn was another great character. She is a very cold, calculating woman. She is the quietest of the four main characters, outside of Alan. She rarely ever said anything and is very careful in what she does say. She has no emotions, and I think arguably she is the most unbiased in her assessment of Flossie. I'd say you could either say Fabian or Terry. She hates Flossie, but she does not present any overly negative picture of her. I think the negative things she says about Flossie, I think we are supposed to treat as the truth. And she has a great moment toward the end of the novel when Alan tells her he wants to read Arthur's diary, and that Arthur is potentially a suspect in killing Flossie, and she just lets out this shriek, and it lasts for maybe a second, but is this emotional outburst that has been festering inside of her, and that she has suppressed for a long time. I think most authors would have ruined this scene, because it is a little awkward and is a little out of character for Terry, but it's been set up for it. And I think Marsh does so very brilliantly. And I think she does it in a way that other authors would have made just not as good. And we have Arthur Rubric, who I wish we knew a little bit more about him. I think he's a decent character, but I would have liked to see more of him. Now, to be fair to Ngaio Marsh, I do think she intentionally downplays him because he's the man behind the woman. He's nobody. He's been erased from his own study. His own private rooms show nothing about him. He's just sort of there. And in a weird way, I find him perfect as is. I think it's a very strange case of a character only being partially developed, but working very well because of that partial development. That's sort of his thing. And a lot of what we know about Arthur comes from Terry, and she depicts him as sort of weak and sympathetic and someone erased by his wife. But in the brief prologue, we do see a little bit of Arthur, and he's a little bit different than that. He does at least try to, convince his wife not to do certain things. And I think what the reader should get out of this is that, all that time with Flossie took its toll on Arthur, and he just sort of surrendered his will and gave up. Because the implication here is that Arthur and Flossie didn't really spend a lot of time together until the war forced them to. Arthur doesn't go back to England when Flossie does. So I think there's sudden new development of him having to spend all of his time with Flossie is just too much for him to handle. And it's a very weird case because I think this so easily could have gone into nagging shrewish wife sort of way. Certainly if Ellery Queen wrote this novel, that's how it would have gone. But Marsh doesn't do that. Flossie to me does come off as a sort of extremely selfish person, but she doesn't come across as a naggy, taming of the shrew sort of way. We have Markins, the butler, and I thought he was fun. Sort of unintentionally entertaining. I know this is not the intent at all, and I'm sure most people didn't get this, but I personally got a lot of sarcastic sitcom butler vibes from him, like Niles from The Nanny or Benson from Soap. It was definitely not intentional because he's a very serious character, but it was the way he spoke openly about the people in his household and their flaws that gave me that impression. He's very honest when speaking to Alan. He does point out all of the flaws, especially those of Douglas and Flossie. And there's a little bit of a double bluff potential going on with Markins. No, I remember when I first read this book, I did think it was Markins and that it was a double bluff. Set up as initially, oh, he's a spy, he's an enemy spy. And then you go, oh no, he's an allied spy, that takes him off. And I thought Marsh was going to turn the tables again and say, oh no, he really was an enemy spy. And she doesn't go there. And I think that's interesting because it does set itself up as a pretty good red herring. I think that is a trap she set for us, and at least I fell into it. And finally, we have Cliff Johns. We so rarely get a character like Cliff Johns in the Golden Age. By the way, by my standards, the book qualifies as a Golden Age novel, just barely. I use the years 1920 through 1945 for the Golden Age. Your mileage may vary, but Cliff Johns is a non-servant blue-collar worker, extremely rare in a Golden Age mystery, but also a teenager. We so rarely see teenagers as well, especially ones that aren't like awkward, but I thought he was a great character. I found him to be very relatable. I was probably about his age when I first read this novel, and I was someone sort of unsure of the future and unsure what to do in life. And I know I said it was contrived, and I stand by that, but pretending to play the piano when it was really the radio and then hiding the manual is definitely something like some kind of scheme I would have done at his age. But again, it was very contrived. I would have failed to get away with it, but I like his struggle between his farm community roots and his unconventional wants and loves of music and the arts, and his struggle to remain loyal to his community and to Flossie when those loyalties are no longer compatible and clash. There's a great internal battle going on here, and I thought it spilled beautifully into the plot of the novel. And we are told that Cliff is going to resume his musical studies. I didn't bring it up in the summary, but Cliff basically stopped playing music after Flossie's death because the emotional trauma of never making amends with her formed a block that Cliff couldn't overcome. But we are told, or at least Alan believes, Cliff will overcome that. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about Dyed in the Wool. Personally, for me, I always remember this novel because of the body being found in the wool clip. To me, that's just so iconic. It's so Ngaio Marsh to have this like wacky plot that actually makes a lot of sense. Like Ngaio Marsh is someone who often has like unusual murder weapons, or like in this case an unusual like location for the body to be found, and she's always someone who grounds that in reality. It always makes sense in the end. It's never over the top or ridiculous. Next week, again, we have another subgenre deep dive, and this time I will be exploring the world of adventure thriller mysteries, which admittedly is probably a subgenre I know like the least about, like in terms of like the history of it and the development of it, but you know, I'll handle that just fine, I'm sure. Until next time, Mystery Files.